NASA's Artemis plan is way too complicated. Too many refueling launches. That's probably one of the most common criticisms people make about NASA's Return to the Moon program. But interestingly, that might not be true for much longer. Because NASA and SpaceX, they are now seriously considering a new mission architecture that can completely reshape how astronauts get to the moon. And the interesting part is, this new approach could significantly reduce the amount of refueling needed, simplify parts of the mission, and most importantly, do all of that without requiring major changes to the hardware itself. Which honestly sounds almost too good to be true. So, what exactly is this new plan? Okay, first off, did you know that one of the biggest reasons Starship needs so much refueling in orbit isn't actually because of Starship itself? A lot of it comes down to the type of lunar orbit NASA chose for the Artemis missions. Right now, NASA plans to use something called Near Rectilinear Halo Orbit, or NRHO for short. It's a really stretched out orbit around the moon, and one full trip around it takes about 7 days. One of the nice things about NRHO is that spacecraft there can almost always stay in contact with Earth, so communication blackouts are minimal. But for a lunar lander like Starship HLS, that orbit creates a pretty major downside. Instead of heading straight toward the lunar surface, Starship first has to slow down and enter this distant orbit around the moon. Then, later, fire its engines again to descend to the surface. After the mission, it has to climb all the way back up to that orbit once more. All of those extra maneuvers cost a lot of energy and, more importantly, a lot of fuel. So why did NASA choose NRHO in the first place? Mainly because of Orion. Orion isn't efficient enough to operate at a close orbit around the moon, so NASA picked NRHO because it's much easier for Orion to come back from. But as I said, it creates a huge disadvantage for Starship HLS. Instead of starting close to the lunar surface, Starship has to travel much farther down to the moon and then climb all the way back up again. That adds around 1.5 kilometers per second of extra delta V to the mission. Now that number might not sound massive, but rocket physics is brutal. Even a small increase in delta V can massively increase fuel requirements, because you need fuel to carry fuel, and then even more fuel to carry that extra fuel. So while Starship may only need around 45 extra tons of usable propellant near the moon itself, the total amount required back in Earth orbit becomes much larger once everything is accounted for. By the time everything is accounted for, the mission could require roughly 450 tons of additional propellant overall, which could translate to 4 or even 5 extra tanker launches just to support the mission. Luckily, both NASA and SpaceX are well aware of this problem, and they've come up with a pretty interesting solution. In the original Artemis plan from years ago, NASA's Space Launch System rocket would launch 4 astronauts inside the Orion capsule, built by Lockheed Martin, and send them toward the moon. Orion would enter lunar orbit first, and then a Starship lander would meet up and dock with it before taking the astronauts down to the surface. But the newer proposal changes things quite a bit. Instead of SLS doing most of the work to send Orion toward the moon, Starship would take on that role. Orion and Starship would actually dock in Earth orbit first, with Starship becoming the main spacecraft responsible for carrying the crew all the way to lunar orbit before landing on the moon. The mission would work something like this. Starship launches first and refuels itself in orbit, which is absolutely necessary because it needs a huge amount of propellant for the trip. Orion then launches separately, meets up with Starship in Earth orbit, and docks with it. From that point on, the astronauts would basically move into Starship and live there during the journey. Starship would then fire its engines and carry both itself and Orion all the way to a much lower lunar orbit, much closer to the moon than the current NRHO plan. Once they arrive, Orion stays behind uncrewed, almost like a parked ride home, while Starship takes the astronauts down to the lunar surface, supports them during the mission, and later brings them back up to orbit. After that, Starship docks with Orion once again, the crew transfers back into the capsule, and Orion handles the trip back to Earth and re-entry. In this setup, Starship ends up doing almost all of the heavy lifting for the mission, while Orion mainly acts as the crew taxi for launch and Earth return. So what does this actually solve? Well, the biggest thing is that it avoids that awkward, near rectilinear halo orbit around the Moon. As I mentioned earlier, that orbit is pretty demanding when it comes to fuel and leaves very little margin for error. Everything has to go almost perfectly. If Starship ends up slightly heavier than expected, if an engine underperforms even a little, or if one of the tanker flights delivers less fuel than planned, the entire mission can start running into serious problems. The new approach is much more forgiving. It uses less fuel overall and gives the system a lot more breathing room. That means SpaceX could either reduce the number of refueling flights needed or fully load Starship and keep extra propellant in reserve for important maneuvers if something goes wrong later in the mission. Another big improvement is that Starship no longer has to sit around waiting in lunar orbit. In the original setup, the lander could end up hanging near the Moon for quite a while before Orion arrives. That's not ideal, because Starship uses super cold cryogenic propellants that slowly boil off over time. If Orion gets delayed, Starship could lose a significant amount of fuel, and suddenly, you're talking about trying to refuel a spacecraft near the Moon, which is about as difficult as it sounds. With the new plan, all the critical operations happen close to Earth instead. Starship refuels in Earth orbit, docks with Orion there, and then both spacecraft leave together for the Moon. So if there's a delay or a problem, it's not automatically a disaster. You can simply launch another tanker and top Starship off again. Fixing issues in Earth orbit is vastly easier than trying to solve them hundreds of thousands of kilometers away near the Moon. And interestingly, this could also have a major impact on SLS itself. As we know, NASA selected a new upper stage for a more standardized version of the rocket, and that upper stage is supposed to push Orion from Earth orbit toward the Moon. The problem is that the development of that stage has become a major bottleneck. If it's delayed, the entire Artemis mission gets delayed with it. But with this new architecture, SLS no longer needs to handle that part of the mission at all. Its job would simply be to place Orion into Earth orbit, while Starship takes over from there. That means even a simpler or less upgraded version of SLS could still support the mission. So the mission may not necessarily become faster on paper, but it removes one of the biggest single points of delay in the entire Artemis program. So even though you still have a similar number of launches, dockings, and operations between Starship and Orion, what really changes is how fragile the overall mission becomes. If this actually goes through, it would be a pretty massive shift in how Artemis missions work. Starship would basically become the main transportation system for getting astronauts to and from the Moon. Orion would still play an important role, but much more like a crew taxi for launch and Earth return, while Starship handles most of the actual mission. And for SLS, a lot of people see this as a pretty major blow, because once Orion's job gets reduced to simply reaching low Earth orbit, the door suddenly opens to other rockets as well. Something like New Glenn could theoretically do that job too with enough upgrades, like human rating and a proper crew access system. And once missions start relying on rendezvous and docking in Earth orbit, it also becomes much easier for future commercial spacecraft to eventually replace or compete with Orion itself. That's just how things work. Newer, cheaper, and more capable technology eventually starts replacing older systems over time. Even though NASA hasn't officially confirmed this new architecture as the path forward, it strangely lines up with a lot of the recent changes the agency has already made to Artemis 3. The original plan for the mission was to land humans near the Moon's south pole as early as 2028. But now, NASA's updated strategy seems to be shifting Artemis 3 into something much closer to a large-scale test mission in low Earth orbit, instead of an immediate lunar landing. Rather than heading straight down to the Moon's surface, the crew would focus on practicing rendezvous and docking operations with lunar landing vehicles. NASA has already said engineers are evaluating new mission profiles and operational concepts to reduce risk ahead of future moon landings during Artemis 4. And one of the biggest clues came in a recent Artemis 3 update, where NASA revealed that SLS would launch with an inert spacer replacing the interim cryogenic propulsion stage. In other words, the upper stage that was originally supposed to help send Orion toward the Moon would no longer actually be needed for that mission profile. Replacing it with a simple spacer also creates another advantage for NASA. It means the final available ICPS can now be saved and flown on Artemis 4 instead, which is currently planned to be the first actual crewed lunar landing attempt in 2028. That gives NASA extra time to finish adapting the Centaur upper stage for future SLS missions, starting with Artemis 5. Under this updated approach, planned for 2027, Orion would rendezvous in Earth orbit with either SpaceX's Starship HLS or Blue Origin's Blue Moon. And honestly, doing these operations near Earth makes a lot of sense from a safety perspective. The crew could test docking procedures, life support systems, and crew transfers while still remaining relatively close to home. If something goes wrong, astronauts could return to Earth within hours instead of being stranded days away near the Moon. NASA also plans to expand testing of the new lunar spacesuits developed by Axiom Space. Since these suits are completely different from the old Apollo-era designs, testing them in open space before attempting a lunar surface mission is incredibly important. Engineers would finally get real-world data on mobility, thermal control, and how the suits actually perform during EVA operations. Without the ICPS upper stage, Orion would instead rely on its own propulsion system to circularize its orbit after reaching space. And interestingly, NASA may have already hinted at this new mission profile. In a May 7th request for information about alternative communication systems for Artemis 3, the agency listed one of its mission assumptions as Orion operating in a low Earth orbit, about 463 kilometers high, at an inclination of 33 degrees. NASA also said that, with input from both Blue Origin and SpaceX, the agency is still defining exactly how the mission will operate. Some details haven't been finalized yet, but astronauts could potentially enter at least one lunar lander test article during the mission. The crew is also expected to spend more time aboard Orion compared to Artemis 2, allowing NASA to further evaluate the spacecraft's life support systems during a longer mission. And for the first time, the mission would also demonstrate Orion's docking system in space, which is a pretty critical capability if future Artemis missions are going to rely heavily on rendezvous and crew transfers between Orion and lunar landers like Starship or Blue Moon. For people familiar with spaceflight history, this entire approach probably sounds very familiar. It closely mirrors what NASA did during Apollo 9. Back then, NASA chose not to rush directly to the Moon. Instead, Apollo 9 focused on testing the lunar module in Earth orbit first, making sure docking, life support, and crew operations actually worked before committing astronauts to a landing attempt. That decision ended up laying the foundation for the success of Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin during the Apollo 11 moon landing.